never happened in 1986. It just would not have.
Well, that's when Malcolm X had his premonition, or what's the word I want to use? His epiphany, okay? Because he was always a black Muslim. And then he did his pilgrimage to Mecca, and he saw other Muslims, and they weren't all black. That's all he had ever known, were black Muslims. He said, wait a minute. Here's Muslims here that are white, that are yellow, that are brown, that have straight hair, they have kinky hair, that speak English, that speak Arabic, that speak Indonesian, that speak all kinds of different languages. But we're all Muslims, so we're all the same, but we all look totally different. And that's when he had his epiphany that, you know what the Nation of Islam stands for is racism. It's not religion, okay? He realized that, and they killed him because he rocked the boat. But you realize that you have more in common with somebody than just skin color. You can have a whole lot more in common with somebody. And the whole communist thing, where it's class warfare, capitalism is kind of a class warfare thing too. Because if you look at the television, you know, if you don't have this car, you're a loser. You want to get this girl? You need to have this car. Now, you want to have the ugly girl, you can get that car if you want to. But if you want the good-looking girl, the really good-looking girl, you got to buy this. You buy a Chevy, you'll be a loser. But if you buy a Ford, man.
Well, you know, you touched on communism for a second. And, Strong, you and I have had this conversation before. You always bring up Joseph Stalin.
Yeah.
Horrible guy.
If it wasn't for Mao Zedong, he may have been the biggest mass murderer of all time. Another communist, by the way.
But the point that you used to bring up was that he was a true communist because the guy had 2 suits and slept on a cot.
Mm-hmm. Owned nothing when he died. He was a true communist. He did. He walked the walk. Killed 50 million people.
But still walked the walk.
But he walked the walk and didn't drink vodka.
Now that I was just going to say, you think he had an extra bottle of vodka in his cot?
Joseph Stalin was a teetotaler, did not drink. But he wasn't Russian either. He was Georgian.
Right.
Yeah. So, didn't drink, but he wasn't Russian. So, one winter, I read 3 books on Joseph Stalin. One of them was
it a cold winter?
It was a cold winter. That's when I discovered Absolute vodka that winter.
I love Absolute and Sky and Grey Goose. I enjoy vodka.
Yeah. Well, the Russian vodka was good stuff. Absolute's not a Russian vodka.
Stoli is.
Is.
Yeah, Absolute is Sweden.
Right, correct. Yeah.
Well, I have a question for either one of you. Have you ever had the opportunity to have 2 or 3 days to hang out with people from a communist country?
Nope.
No, I'm trying to think if I've ever hung around with. I did. I've spent time in China, but to be fair, I would spend the day with the customer. But I don't know that they were communists, because most people in China aren't members of the party. So I would have to say, from a communist country, I spent a day with them, but never several days continually. Have you?
Yes. And this is the reason I was asking this, because very shortly after Mikhail Gorbachev got into power in Russia, James knows I'm a caver. I'm a caver. And there are cavers all over the world.
You don't say spelunker.
No, we don't say spelunker. I've been a caver since for 30 years.
Cool.
And right after that kind of loosening of between the countries, where they were sending people from here over to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union still existed at
Glasnost,
that point.
Is that what they called that?
Yes, Glasnost. But the Soviet Union still existed. It had not broken up yet. But the cavers in the United States and the cavers from Russia and Ukraine, we had been communicating for years because, on a scientific basis, talking about speleology and what people are learning from their localities. Well, between the National Speleological Society and whatever the caving club is over there, they decided there was one fellow was a PhD karst geologist. He and 5 other people from Ukraine and four people from Ukraine and one fellow who was from Russia were brought to the United States and spent 6 months here. There was no monetary unit of exchange between the ruble and the dollar.
Right.
At that point. So what they did was they figured out a way they flew them into New York, and they got a return ticket out of L.A. And they spent 6 months basically going from across the country, being handed off from one caving group to the next caving group, who supported them for 2 or 3 days.
So they would be hosted by a
Right.
family. Okay.
Well, not necessarily a family. It could be a caving grotto.
Okay.
A local group around here.
Okay.
And I was a member of one of those. We had these 6 guys, and they had 2 reasons for coming to the United States. The first one was they wanted to see our caves and springs and karst. And the second reason was they wanted to learn how we ran show caves and how we convinced people to pay money
to go into like Merrimack Caverns.
Go into holes in the ground.
Wow.
Okay.
Because they came up with great taglines like Onondaga, Onondaga, Onondaga.
Well, that's my husband was the first naturalist at Onondaga in 1984.
Outstanding.
But anyway, so they were in St. Louis for 3 days. They stayed in the St. Louis area, and then we took them down to Onondaga and Merrimack Caverns and showed them how those 2 caves had been commercialized. And then we took them from there down to the Ozark Riverways and showed them the large springs down there and Round Spring Caverns, which is government cave, but it's still a show cave. And then that was where I left the group, and they were passed off to somebody from Springfield.
Sure.
But the point is, they did not stay at my house, but I spent, like 8 o'clock in the morning to 10 o'clock at night with these people.
Uh-huh.
Only one of them spoke English.
Wow.
How did you communicate?
That was kind of interesting because we're talking geology, we had maps, and you could point at the maps. I actually made about a 24-page booklet about the springs, and we got one guy from the St. Louis Symphony to translate it into Russian.
Really?
Because they all knew Russian. I mean, even the folks from Ukraine who all
Sure.
knew Ukrainian, they had to speak Russian because they were part of the Soviet Union. And it turns out that a fellow named Konstantin and we were trying to do this thing with our hands to talk about something, and it wasn't working very well. And we found out that he had Spanish in school, and so had I.
There you go.
So we have a Ukrainian and an American speaking
Spanish
in the Ozarks
That's great.
to communicate.
Well, how were the communists? First of all, were they communists or were they just from a communist country?
The one fellow from Russia was a member of the party.
Okay.
And obviously the rest of them had to toe the line.
Because Dad was watching.
Right. The professor, who was not the fellow from Russia, was an internationally known speleologist, and he spoke English very well. Mm-hmm. We asked, people asked him, well, what do you like about the United States? And, if we were transported to Russia and say, what do you like about Russia?
Yeah. And
you know what the answer was?
No.
18-wheeler trucks.
Really?
That bring food to all the grocery stores, and there is never an empty shelf on the store shelf.
I believe it.
And if you would think about, everything, 230 years of America, 18-wheeler trucks would not be the thing you would tell a Martian. But, so they were actually not so much looking to become capitalists.
They just wanted to eat.
Well, yeah, but they were wanting to know, again, like I said, how we could convince people to, show the caves, and there are in the Caucasus. You were talking about Georgia. There's some very nice caves. There are several over there that are. I think the deepest cave in the world is still in Russia.
Okay,
We've got the longest. Mammoth is the longest, but there's some. And I'm talking about a cave because there's some people who think some of the connected Hawaii lava tubes are one cave, but that's, it's not that deep. I mean, this is like, about 1,500 meters deep, 3,000 to 4,000, feet deep. They weren't planning on commercializing that one, but they had a lot of pretty ones that they could do this with. So they were actually kind of learning how to become a capitalist.
Did you point out all the barns on the way down to Merrimack Caverns that they just painted? Visit Merrimack Caverns, 66 degrees.
And do you know how they changed those? In the summer, they're painted that it's cool, and in the winter, it's painted that it's warm.
Makes sense.
The temperature doesn't change.
Temperature doesn't change.
But relative to the outside temperature, it does.
Right.
Wow.
But like I said, it was interesting to me. I wish they would have brought some women over, which they did not. But, how much we had in common. That Alex Klimchuk's saying was cavers are cavers everywhere. And, that is true. We're all a few bubbles off in the same direction.
And again, you were from different countries. You spoke different languages. You were of different socioeconomic backgrounds. But you were all cavers.
Right.
And
commonality.
There's the commonality. Exactly.
So I'm, in that respect, they weren't trying to convert us. We weren't trying to convert them. We were just trying to have a good time. And yes, they drank an awful lot of vodka.
That's great.
Well, I knew the deepest cave was in Russia.
Yes.
And here's why I knew that. Because on Coast to Coast with Art Bell one time, they had a guy who went to the deepest cave in Russia, and they lowered a microphone. And Art Bell broadcast the sounds of hell that they picked up from that cave and the microphone. It was on Coast to Coast with Art Bell.
So it had to be the truth.
It had to be the truth. And you could hear the screaming. And they were convinced that these were the sounds of hell because the cave was so deep.
I went to the center of the earth where the devil is.
Well, hey, we're an hour and 12 minutes into the 40-minute podcast. I knew we'd go way over, but then we always do when we have an interesting topic. Parting words on communism, where we're at, where we're going to be, why we even have it.
Ladies first.
That must be you, Joe. I know he's not talking to me.
I guess my parting word is at least find out what it is you're talking about before you label something which is not communism, capitalism, or socialism. At least, have some, look it up. If you look it up on your phone but the major reason for doing this is I hear people call communism something that it isn't, socialism something that it isn't, and capitalism, again, something that it isn't. Mad Dog just said he was an entrepreneur. So am I. Is that being an entrepreneur capitalist? Yes. It's the same as being, the head of Microsoft? No. And, there's a whole raft of things like that, and I'm sure, we talked a little bit about the, co-ops. Co-ops are somewhat socialist. They seem to work, though. But that's basically my reason for wanting to talk about this, is because I hear things mislabeled so much. So if you're going to use those terms, at least define them or use them correctly.
Good advice. Mad Dog?
Yeah, that's what I took out of this meeting of the minds, is that, coming into it, I didn't quite know what to expect. But as in so many other things, if you don't define what it is or what you are, then you can go off on a tangent and make an assumption